Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we're deciphering the 1994 science fiction action-adventure film Stargate, directed and co-written by Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin. This is also the first entry in the larger Stargate franchise, and it stars Kurt Russell, James Spader, Jay Davison, Alexis Cruz, and Eric Avari. And joining us today to unlock the seventh symbol is Dr. David S. Anderson, Associate Professor of Anthropological Sciences at Radford University. Thank you for coming back, David. I think this is your third time with us.
It is my third time, although apparently it should have been the seventh time. We're going to get there.
So we'll start with David first. What is your exposure to Stargate? I don't know if you saw this one in theaters or later, and do you dig this film?
I strangely dig this film. I think one of the last times I was on, we were talking about Eternals, and Eternals always sort of gives me the heebie-jeebies because they kind of bury the ancient alien threads, and I think they kind of, some people don't really realize the problematic inherent nature of it. Where here, it's so much in your face that you can't really miss any of the issues. And so I feel like, I'm sure this movie misled a few people, but I think a lot of people just went along for the fun ride.
Yeah. And Eli and Christy, had either of you seen this before, or was this just me being like, Stargate?
I thought I had seen this before. I thought that I had seen all of it at bits and pieces on the Sci-Fi Channel. And I realized very quickly, I have not seen all of this movie. Once they're going through the Stargate, I was like, oh no, I have no idea what's going to happen next. So that was actually kind of a delightful surprise. And I think I ended up digging this movie more than I thought I would. Mm-hmm. It was very entertaining and fun, and it had that kind of old school nostalgic feel that I get from things like The Mummy and The Scorpion King and some more early aughts weird action adventure sci-fi stories. I wish that I had seen this as a younger person, because I feel like I would be on the Colin train of Stargate.
Lige, I would argue you did see this as a younger person, and it was called Disney's Atlantis.
Yes.
Fair enough. Well, okay. I want to say that I watched the translation scene of the chalkboard, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, and I said, I know why Colin likes this movie. I understand why my good friend Colin loves this movie. So that's where I'm coming from.
Christy, how about you?
Yeah,
Christy, who texted us partway through watching this to be like, wait a minute, this is just Atlantis.
This is live action Atlantis.
Just Atlantis.
Which obviously means I dig it because I love animated Disney movies. Although I argued that they could have really used a Vinny just to have a little bit more fun moments in there.
There's not a lot of comedic relief in here.
French Stewart wasn't doing it for you?
No, not quite. What I will say is I really agree on David's point that the ancient alien stuff is right there front and center. And because I was watching it on Prime, and Emmerich, one of the co-writers, actually comes out and says he was inspired by a documentary he saw in film school called Chariot of the Gods. I'm like, there it is. All right. That checks out. So I kind of liked that it was overtly, all right, ancient aliens is happening here. And the thing I've been learning having watched all of these films about archaeology is that films about archaeology are not what archaeology is about, which is reconstructing past cultures and histories. I need to start looking at archaeology films as portrayals of the culture of archaeologists, which some of these do a really good job of. And I would argue there's definitely some elements here that is doing some really good work about what is archaeology about? What are some of the problems that exist in archaeological discovery? And so if you look at it from that lens, I think this film is actually a really good kind of look at our world. And I'm sure we'll get into it more. But yeah, I enjoyed it. Needs a Vinny, though. Needs a demo
Okay.
man.
I have to register my genuine surprise because I was completely prepared to like mount sort of valiant defense for a movie that honestly I don't even think really deserves it. I was like, I love part of my read is like I love this movie despite myself. Like I don't actually think it's a good movie. A critic I like once described the films of Roland Emmerich as Spielberg for morons. Which
Oh,
it kind
no.
It's very full of tropes. Like it really
Very
does.
much.
And
Yes.
that's where I was most kind of getting hung up on this most recent review of I was trying to kind of figure out or see if I could triangulate like how many either movie tropes or sci-fi tropes or ancient aliens things, like how much of that like originates in this movie? Like the idea, a bunch of people in a military installation looking at a bunch of guys walking through a portal, or the whole ancient aliens-ness and just so many parts of it, and how much of this movie is like just a kind of collection, like an aggregation of these things, and it's kind of chicken and the eggy a little bit, but yeah, and like I think for what it is, this movie I do enjoy. There's all sorts of weirdnesses to it and its goofiness and also its soundtrack that I want to talk about later, but yeah, I do kind of I dig this movie, albeit with a big asterisk of like
Sure.
it
As
is what it
always,
is.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I also walked away like, man, the 90s were a simpler time, and like
It really was so
there's,
much.
there's so much about the ethos of this film and
Mhm.
the morality and the sort of storycraft that's like, on one hand, it's like we can look at it and be like, yes, we've come a long way, and like there's a lot wrong going on here, but like also just the earnesty of this and how convinced and like unproblematic the movie thinks it's being is fascinating in and of itself.
Yeah.
I wanted to point out too, we recently covered a show that Roland Emmerich did, which was Those About to Die. And I was looking at his like filmography, and it's such a weird combination of sci-fi and ancient history.
Oh yeah. No, he'll pull in the ancient weirdness whenever he can.
Oh, yeah.
And this is very, as I was watching this, I'm like, right, I'm really just seeing this as like, this is like a stepping stone to Independence Day.
Yeah.
Where,
But also
yeah.
to like 10,000 BC.
Mhm.
Like,
Yes.
I was surprised when I was looking back through. I was like, okay, I see the Independence Day. And I was like, oh, and 10,000 BC, which
Yeah.
also has this whole weird, like,
Mhm.
I don't know if it's actually aliens in that movie, but it's some sort of like weird extra David
Yeah.
Bowie.
10,000 BC, I will always remember because it had this beautifully distilled line where, because there's a whole bunch of pseudo-archaeology sort of floating beneath the surface of 10,000 BC, but they don't really engage with most of it, except there's one line when they're talking about the pyramid builders where the guy says, I'm paraphrasing because it's been a while since I watched this one, but it's like, no one knows where they come from, maybe from beyond the stars, or maybe their continent sunk beneath the ocean. Like they did this like ancient aliens Atlantis line in like 5 seconds, and they're like, done. Like we'll just throw it all in there.
I'm wondering if like is 10,000 BC like a sleeper prequel to this movie, because like in the movie they talk about the Egyptians or the ancient people overthrowing Ra and rebelling, and like that's kind of what happens in 10,000 BC. There's
so much about this movie that I wonder where it came from out of Roland Emmerich's head, because there's so many ways that it's in the 90s, it was kind of a low moment for ancient alien stuff. It's well before the TV show gets going. It's sort of after the peak of Eric von Daniken's fame. There's obviously some other stuff floating around in the ether. But yeah, like it wasn't super ancient alien-y during the 1990s when this came out. And yet it also distills so much of the pop culture that came before it. And this is one of the things I've dealt with before in publications and elsewhere. Like ancient alien lore and tropes were solidly established in pulp fiction and comic books by like the 40s and 50s, well before Eric von Daniken and whatnot. Like, and Emmerich in this film, it's almost like it's just like a distillation of something that Hollywood and or the pulps have been doing for almost 100 years by the time this film comes out. And it's like, part of me is convinced that he was deliberately cribbing that stuff, and part of me is like, no, he just grew up around this and it's so saturated that it just comes out naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's also like a big deviation from what we saw with the like Indiana Jones, the original trilogy, because we talked about how that was much more mysticism and really into like there are things that are unexplained, but they're supernatural. They're not necessarily alien. And then the later ones, you have Crystal Skull, which is very aliens, and then a kind of redirection with the fifth one, the Dial of Destiny, which was actually, well, we have a rational explanation that does fit more in a sci-fi genre again. So it's really interesting how even Indiana Jones kind of, I think, looked at Stargate and be like, maybe we should change direction a little bit with like how we're looking at these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know where I want to start. Like, there's so much.
I mean, I guess the plot. That's like probably the we work. So we begin with in the 20s in a scene that one feels straight out of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
100%.
Yeah, they're excavating in Egypt and they uncover this Stargate. Again, there's this reverential reveal of the gate.
First, they find the cover stones.
Yes.
And a note in my head, I'm like, it would be so satisfying to like find those and sweep those off. Like that is just an easy, like they're giant stones. You can't do much damage. You just wipe them. Oh, that would be so pleasant.
Writing on them. Like,
yeah. Oh, it would feel so good to find them.
There's also the moment of startlingly bad archaeological ethics where the young girl just picks up the gold necklace and walks off with it. Like, I'll just take this now.
And just gets to keep it.
It's funny though, because like if we think, like I kind of liked, because there was some cool stuff happening in that massive excavation scene where like you see artifact processing happening, where like you see tents and tables set up with them cleaning different artifacts. You see meal prep happening. And I've grown up knowing people who like grew up with parents who were archaeologists and they like were taken to the field as a small child. And I remember a professor telling me, it's like, yeah, one day I found this cool little clay doll in the ground. And then like she was a little girl. And it's like, and then one of the workers like looked at it, like went yoink and walked away. And I didn't see it again until 20 years later in the museum.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, maybe that could happen.
And so, so we start with this kind of prequel in the 20s, and then we jump forward to meet, I guess, our two leads, James Spader and Kurt Russell, who are both down on their luck. James Spader, because he is basically, he's at an academic conference where he's just bombing it, and everybody thinks he's a quack because I guess the meat of his talk is that the pyramids are older than we think or something like that.
Yeah.
He's trying. He doesn't necessarily push aliens right away, but he falls into this, core pseudo-archaeology moment of like, no, there's no evidence the Egyptian pyramids were built by Egyptians. Like, there's tons of evidence.
Yes. And so he's laughed out of the conference, and then he gets into a limousine of a rich person / the military, where he is offered a job on some secret project. And then we also meet Kurt Russell, who, as the very callous military person explains, his kid died.
I thought that maybe, did they like dub that over just like a still because they're like, oh, we forgot to say this, and like the audience needs to hear it in words and not just visuals, so we need to pretend that these cops are.
Well, that's an interesting thought, because that scene is odd where like you can't even see their faces anymore. The two officers as they're getting in the car, they might have had to add that in. Like, oh wait, we forgot to explain why he's
forgot to actually say it.
Well, it seems in some ways like kind of like this when I said Emmerich is like Spielberg for morons, like this is the perfect example of it, where you like the beginning of the scene is like actually I would argue pretty effective, or like the wife's, you're like you can try to talk to him, and then you see him looking at the picture of the kid and the gun, and it's all conveyed visually. And then at the very last minute, the director / writer just doesn't have faith in the audience to put two and two together, and just like, just throw in a line that's like, oh yeah, his kid shot himself, so the audience knows.
So okay, so this is going to be a weird sidebar away from archaeology, but the whole gun presentation throughout the film to me was so interesting and so reminiscent of the 90s, of a very simplified problem that is very complicated today. And I think it was actually kind of important that they state that the kid shot himself, because you're showing two issues with the gun at the same time, right? You have military personnel with suicide ideation who are more likely to kill themselves with the gun. And then you have The number one killer currently in the United States is children in firearms and
Yes.
just not properly stored guns. And like those are like big issues that exist in gun control. But this is pre-Columbine. This is it is interesting. This is also the same year I looked it up that the assault weapons ban went into place because there had been earlier shootings with those military grade weapons.
Interesting.
And that happened. So it seemed like there was a much more civil discussion of like, hey, here's a problem we do have with guns. But also, if we want to fight tyranny, because we'll talk about this later in the plot,
Let us arm the children.
We need,
we
yes,
need to
arm the
arm
children.
the children.
Yeah.
And you're like, what a simple time.
Well, like just the fact that the movie can present those two things with like zero sense of irony or self-awareness.
Yes.
I think it was so much simpler back then, though, right? Like, Columbine is like a core memory I have from my childhood. I remember like news coverage of
absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's become so much more complicated since then that it felt nice to have it be that simple. And yet at the same time was really frustrating. I'm like, no, this should not be a Second Amendment argument being presented in a sci-fi film. I'm sorry.
So we have, Kurt Russell, and then we are brought to this military base where they have been deciphering this cover stone and the Stargate. And my favorite scene where James Spader comes in and he looks at this translation and just dunks on Richard Kind and just eviscerates his translation work by revealing that it's not a gate to heaven, it's a Stargate.
Also,
I'm with a lot of that scene where it's like, sure, translation, there's a lot of like nuance here. Gate to heaven seems like a pretty reasonable translation.
I agree.
Yeah.
Weirdly idiomatic.
Yeah. I really like that he also says it's like he says for all eternity and he crosses it out and says for all time.
Yeah,
and then in
what's
The
the
Mummy, it's the opposite. He says like for all time. It's for all eternity, you idiot. And so it's like, is that, are they trying to, I don't know, but I enjoyed that part.
There was or were some Egyptologists who consulted on the film, right?
That is my understanding. I don't know the list in front of me,
Yeah.
but
Like the hieroglyphics and some in the art direction is like, it's not completely like I assumed actually, given the filmmaker, and that this was just ancient Egypt, the vibe, and run with that. But there is something, I think, to at least the hieroglyphics part.
Or at least they got some of the books because they made fun of the author's translation. Called that out specifically. So I'm like, okay.
That's funny.
Yeah.
the thing that stood out to me in this scene actually, which didn't when I was a teenager, an American teenager, I will add, but now that I've worked in archaeology and worked internationally for years, the Germans excavated this thing back in the 20s, and now it's in an American military base. Like, there's a big backstory here that they don't even like remotely
Oh my
touch
God.
on.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that of like the implied lore.
Yeah, like something happened where like world, maybe the Americans seized it during World War II. I don't know.
Yeah.
Seems likely.
So on another weird side note, because I was looking into the history of the franchise more, and apparently there'd been rumors going around for a long time that Stargate was going to get another reboot because they got bought by Amazon, and like Chris Evans was supposedly going to be involved in. There's like no confirmation from like any of the original writers or creators that like anything like that is actually planned. But if they did, that could be a really fun storyline of like, how exactly did Stargate, with the help of Captain America, get into America?
You've got like, maybe it's because we just watched Dial of Destiny, but like Operation Paperclip is on the brain of like, bringing over these Nazi scientists to consult on the Stargate.
I can see
There
it.
you go. We can just write our own movie right here now. Like,
yep. You can get like there's some kind of time loop paradox thing where like somehow in the future the A-bomb got sent back, which is how Oppenheimer figured out the A-bomb.
I'm more okay with that than not, honestly. Other than like it's like, why do we have pyramids in central Mexico when the Egyptians made them? I'm like, dude.
Well, there is the saving grace for the franchise, now that we're just cooking and we're fully in the writer's room, is that the aliens, like the Ra's of the world, are actually just humans, and it's like this, time loop paradox thing.
Okay. I have a question. I have a serious, actual cinematic question. Okay, Ra is an alien.
Yes.
were his guards aliens or humans?
That's a
Unclear.
good question. I assume they're humans.
I did
Yeah.
too, because like even though they had like the helmets and stuff,
Mhm.
like baby Jimin Hansu, who we have seen in so many movies, was
Who's
a
just
guard.
credited as Jaimin here. Just first name. He's like Cher.
Fair enough. You do you. He's Horus, right? Like he
Yeah.
has a hawk head or
Yeah.
something.
Well, and to be fair, originally, and we'll talk about this later because this is another interesting thing I found. Originally, Ra was just supposed to be a human working for the alien. So I think it would stand to reason originally all of these people were humans.
they're just like coerced and or employed.
They're the middlemen, right?
They're the middlemen.
They're like
right?
the
Okay.
pyramid scheme. You got the alien on top.
Exactly.
You've got the Egyptian gods,
It's so
overseers, and
It
then
should have been the title of this movie, The Pyramid Scheme.
The pyramid scheme.
But yeah, it's like
Nice.
you employ some people in the population to
Right.
oppress the rest of the population.
Naturally. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
I think it's
Because-
part of what makes this movie sort of less offensive to me as an archaeologist is that it's just one bad actor. Like and not
Mhm.
the acting. I mean, it's one bad alien who's like,
Yeah.
I'm just want to live forever, so I'm going to take over these humans. Like, and it's not the whole like they are here to teach us wisdom and how to
Yeah.
stack stones on top of
Yes.
each
Yeah.
other.
And my headcanon is that Ra is kind of so megalomaniac. He's such a megalomaniac. No, I'm saying it wrong. Megalomaniac, and he's such like an egoist that like he doesn't want other aliens. Like it's just him and his operation. He's like he's a party of one.
yeah.
And I think there were plans with the show and maybe the sequels that like there were going to be other pantheons and other aliens. Like each pantheon was going to be like a different alien or an alien species or some kind of like where there was Ra doing this thing, and then there were other guys who represent whatever it is, like Mesoamerica or the Greek pantheon or et cetera, et cetera. And that was going to be the kind of conceit for like the show, which I don't think totally ended up being the case. Well, maybe it did.
I have to claim total ignorance on the shows. As much as I've
Same.
seen this movie was a big influence on me when I was younger. I have never seen any of the shows. Although I've
heard the original show was good.
I had a crazy moment in the classroom once where somehow I was talking about this movie and a student just more or less like stopped and they're like, there's a movie? Like they had seen all the shows and they had no idea there was an original movie.
Oh, that's so fun. I love that.
Yeah. I think that's also a good point of like it's less offensive because what Ra is doing as the alien is basically what we're trying to do with, or I would say what Elon Musk is trying to do with his SpaceX stuff, which is go find a habitable planet to settle. Ideally, I think what Elon would rather do is conquer because, like, what are you going to do once you get there with all your rich friends? Who of you is going to do the hard labor?
Mm-hmm.
And
well, that's why Stargate, you bring people over to do the hard labor.
Yeah.
I think that's part of what I really enjoyed about this is that it has this very base capitalistic motivation of like, I just need labor. I just need slaves to come do my work. And this is how I'm going to do it. And that's such a great bad guy. Like, awesome. Yeah.
Well, it's the part of the movie that raises the most questions for me too, in terms of the inspiration and influence, because it with the taking the labor and the pyramids, it actually echoes a very old 1898 sci-fi novel by Garrett Serviss called Edison's Conquest of Mars. And this is a whole weird story because basically Serviss had apparently plagiarized War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells and written his own version of War of the Worlds, but then his plagiarized book was so good that he got to write a sequel. And in the sequel, the humans take the fight to Mars. And when they get to Mars, they encounter this population of humans living on Mars. And it turns out that there were ancient aliens involved, that the aliens had come to Earth and had them build the pyramids and carve the Sphinx. And then they took some of those humans back to Mars with them to work as laborers. And so it's this very weird echo to Stargate that is, over or almost exactly 100 years earlier in that process. But it's to your point, Elijah, though, this is such a repeated trope that it's like maybe he didn't even intentionally do this. I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and that's why like it's less offensive as an archaeology movie because it's like this is so sci-fi. Like this makes sense in a sci-fi frame. And also like why the military would be interested. Like why is the US military interested in this gate? And it's kind of interesting that it's presented as like we're not sure what's going to be on the other side. It's like it's never stated why they'd be interested in it, but it's like but the answer's kind of obvious. You're hoping for resources, you're hoping for possibly new and that was the thing, right? They're pointing out that like once the location happens it's like it has oxygen. You're like because ozone, there's a hole in the ozone at this time as well. Just
true.
for all of you Gen Zers who have had climate change, we had ozone when we were growing up. Be a thing.
Or lack thereof.
It came back. We did our part and brought the ozone back. We need to we need to rally and do the rest now. Oh man. Which is very different than like there is military political interest in archaeology, right? It's not to find usually an ancient advanced technology. It is very much about nation building and like land claims is a huge aspect of it. You have it. That's how archaeology was treated in Israel and Palestine for a long time. That is what the mound builders and a lot of the initial archaeology happening in the United States. People are still like, oh, Vikings came here and they obviously brought the Clovis point or whatever nonsense with them.
Oh, boy.
I haven't heard that one quite.
Isn't it like there's something about the Clovis point specifically that has
well, yes.
There's a Solutrean hypothesis.
The Solutrean. There we go. That's what it is.
Yeah, claiming that the Clovis point is derivative of the Solutrean points of Europe, even though you've got a several thousand-year gap between the two to deal with, let alone the transport across the Atlantic, which, Solutrean hypothesis is it's actually one of my favorite examples in the classroom for, like, there's a difference between bad archaeology and pseudo-archaeology. There's some really bad archaeology out there.
There is,
but it's still based on fundamentals.
Yeah, so yeah, and that's kind of, I mean, archaeology has always had that political aspect. It's had a eugenics aspect, right? Like we've wanted to map the progress of civilization as we bring it to other cultural groups that we didn't view as civilized and like have that be a legitimate reason for like this is why our technology is better than your technology and why you should use it.
Yeah.
And why you should give us your resources so we can make better technology out of it and then sell it to you for a higher price.
Yeah, it makes me think of also the history of archaeologists serving as spies in World War II and before. Like there really is that not legitimate, but actual history of archaeology and military overlapping. But I don't think they've seized any Stargates. Although there was what was the claim? And now I'm forgetting it. That there was a claim that during the Iraq War that the Allied forces like walked off with a Stargate or something. There's a conspiracy about the Iraq War and U.S. forces or coalition forces taking something, but I'm forgetting what it is now. It might have been a Stargate.
And to kind of like to tie it back in of like this movie's kind of very, I would say, generic for the time ethos of of like a deep suspicion of the military, which broadly, I guess, is like a post-Vietnam thing in film. Like the military has never been the good guy since the 70s.
That's an astute observation because we see that with Indiana Jones too, right? When he finds the Ark of the Covenant, it is removed by the military and taken to Area 51 to be hidden away from the public.
Or like you have, at least even just in other Emmerich films, like there are good people in the military, but the military itself, the like vague amorphous they is kind of a little bit like in this movie, right? They're sneaking in nukes and things like that.
Right.
I'm trying to remember Independence Day because in my head I feel like the military comes off pretty well in Independence Day, but they're also hiding secrets, and so I guess there's
and they're ineffectual. Like they immediately try to nuke the aliens when it isn't working. They don't listen to the Jeff Goldblum character. They don't consult the scientists or
So how many Emmerich films include Area 51 and nuking aliens? Because we got at least two. Like,
Well, even just like and like Godzilla kind of fits into this a
Yeah,
little
I see
bit.
that.
Sure.
And even like the day after tomorrow, it's like they don't listen to the scientists, right? Like they aren't taking things seriously.
Yeah, they're either nefarious or incompetent or
Yeah.
some combination of both.
Yeah. There
Okay,
I was
okay.
going to speak on Independence Day. I feel like I've heard before that due to using some equipment from the US Army or something like that,
Oh, they have to
they had a
like,
say,
Oh.
had a say in like
Interesting.
their portrayal within the film because they were trying to use uniforms or equipment by
that's
the
the
US
thing.
Army.
Like if you're gonna like Top Gun films, I think bump into this. Like if you're gonna use or film with like military, like it has to kind of in some way be like glamorizing in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that might be an interesting like why we see that slight change with that film as opposed to this one.
I will say though, in like the comparison we make to Atlantis, the animated film,
Mhm.
like the military folks with the nukes in Stargate get kind of like a redemption arc. Like they
Yeah.
make the right choices. They want to help the people. They are kind of like changed by their experience. That is not so much the case in some other
Yes.
movies where we don't like
That's true.
have some sort of like there is value in these characters. They're not just a big bad. And I almost part of me doesn't like that because I kind of like that the bad guys get their comeuppance in movies like Atlantis. But it's also interesting to have all of these shades of gray and this forgiveness for characters who make mistakes.
Yeah.
And maybe again a simpler time.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, how you know it's a simpler time, Kurt Russell, like that was kind of the point of the inputting the quote too, is like they're kind of highlighting it's like, hey, he seems a bit off his rocker. Like they're pointing out that he is in fact has suicide ideation. Is that the best person you want on
No, I
a
think that's
military
exactly
mission?
That's why because his whole mission was he's going to send everybody back, stay behind with the
And he
bomb
is
and
doing
blow
the
it up.
suicide.
And
But is
they
that
picked him.
his plan because
Yes.
he has
I
this
think
issue,
so,
or is it the
yeah.
military's
Yes.
plan as a whole? Is my other question.
I think they picked him because he's suicidal, and then
That could be, yeah.
That's the way I read it, which is pretty dark unto itself, actually, if you want to say bad things about the military.
Yeah.
Right?
But the simplification is like now that he's had his grand adventure, it almost like literally at the end is like, oh, I'm good now, guys.
Yes.
Yeah, he's just like, yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
All they needed to do was like lead an armed insurrection and like to Eli's point is in both films the colonizers are villains, but in a Stargate the colonizer is an off-world colonizer, like this alien colonizing force, whereas in Atlantis we bring the colonizers with us when we go to whatever Atlantis we'll call it. Both places might as well be called Atlantis.
It's called Abydos, as we learned later in the TV series. Is the planet they
Oh,
go
do
to?
they
It's
give it a
named
name?
Abydos. Yeah.
Okay.
Or Abydos, however you say it.
And I lost where I was going.
I'm
with
sorry.
this.
I'm sorry.
No,
Colonizers
you're
off planet coming out to this planet that might as well be Atlantis.
No,
I tried.
it was something about Kurt Russell's character and that he like finds a new like joie de vivre in like leading an armed insurrection.
Yeah.
I remember what I was going to say. The colonizers in like us sort of vague colonizing force in Stargate, we bring exactly two technologies to this new planet, which are cigarettes and guns. Which in the end, it feels like I wonder if like Gene Roddenberry watched this and just like all of the entire like Star Trek ethos, which like is a show that's great for like having deep philosophical conversations about like how much can we or should we intervene in another indigenous population or like affect the course of their history with our superior technology and experience. And then Stargate is like all that. Like let's just
the Prime Directive does not apply. They have already been moved out of their original home planet. So I mean, the military can do what they want there.
We will go to this effectively, I guess, like Bronze Age level civilization and give them machine guns
and cigarettes.
Yeah.
Nothing bad will happen.
Yeah. Okay, this is kind of another question. So we plot-wise, we find the seventh symbol in all of the wonderful archaeological ways that you would. But then like we go through the Stargate.
Kind.
Yes, naturally, yes. We go through the Stargate. They, encounter the civilization, like these people who eventually we find out are speaking some sort of dialect of old, like ancient Egyptian.
Mm-hmm.
They are like us, but not us. They are the past, but not our past. They are human, but different. And it feels kind of like some sort of anthropological wet dream in that, like, how awesome would it be to find this like perfectly isolated group of people who have been deprived of reading and writing, who like have been stunted in some way in their quote unquote development of civilization. And it feels like almost like a big, just you can kind of do whatever you want because it doesn't matter, because it's different enough. And I felt so kind of icky about all of their involvement with
because I think part of it is because this culture is so like infantilized.
Yes.
It's like
they do a lot of privatization tropes. Yeah.
Is there like an element of, because the leader is immortal and has not changed, like leadership has not changed for all of this time, therefore you maintain this osmosis of society, basically? Is that because it kind of like puts forward?
It's just like the culture, like not in the sense that the culture is primitive, like the individual people themselves are also like underdeveloped. Like they feel like they have child brains in a way. We're also even in a way that doesn't even feel like children don't even act like this. Like the scene with the lighter, and they're like so fascinated by the lighter.
Yeah.
And it's like, you look like you have fire. Like then when one of the kids like touches it's like, what fire is like. It feels insulting in some way.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. It's I don't even know if I could like, I don't have the Hollywood pedigree in me to do this, but I feel like there are so many tropes of infantilization or of privatization that these people who live in like 3-story buildings and have a large scale city that they've built themselves don't, like you said, don't know what fire is apparently,
right,
and walk around saying like have no idea how to like communicate with people with across languages. I feel like there's probably a whole bunch of old Hollywood colonialism movies that like do all these same things.
That was kind of my issue with the reading and writing being like the only named thing that is like keeping people under control and rebelling is like you limit reading and writing. It's like, well, that's one of many things you do, but also the language is pictographs. They're not hard to pick up on in terms of like learning a script and divining meaning from what that might indicate.
Yeah, it feels like the way, like this feels like the kind of logical endpoint of like the way European colonizers would like describe encountering these other cultures and like think about them or portray them as these sort of children, like, with like full of infinite wonder and potential, but unmolded by or uncorrupted by modernity or civilization or whatever. And in a way that's like insulting and more than a little racist. And just this feels like the sort of almost the most extreme version of that.
Yeah.
And then they can also quickly learn how to use guns, right? Like
very quickly.
And with the right,
quickly.
I mean,
a child could do it.
Yeah, like the white saviorism of the movie of just like, yes, we can go and we can teach them with the right leadership and guidance. We can mold them into an effective paramilitary force.
Yeah, so I think that just all of their interactions with the humans on the other planet through the Stargate.
The bride gifting scene is the one that jumps out.
Yeah.
That one. Yeah.
Which I totally forgot about when I revisited it.
It was like something about this feels like just icky. Like there's something unethical about like him agreeing to like marry her. And I know they like doesn't seem like they get
quite
to
a few icky things, I think. Yes.
But I think that does again speak a little bit to the authenticity of the discipline of anthropology and archaeology, right? Like that was kind of the assumption made by archaeologists or anthropologists traveling to primitive societies, as they dubbed it, and they literally.
She's doing air quotes for our listeners.
Oh, so many air quotes, y'all! So many, and like literally view it as a free. I was literally watching someone. He was actually a painter. He's the one who went down to. like a Southeast Asia country or something, and he like married a bunch of girls who were like 13 or 14. Paul Gauguin, and he literally says like in his letters, is like, but in like Europe they'd be 18 or 19, which indicates he knows that this would not be acceptable. He was also married to a European woman too, while going and impregnating 13-year-olds in a foreign country. So I was like, this did actually happen. Like, yeah, it's icky, but it's also kind of true to like what was happening early on in a lot of disciplines that involved travel, basically.
Fair enough.
So,
but it still was icky.
Very.
Can I rewind us a little bit in the plot to one of the points that I thought might come off to someone as like not legitimate, but I wanted to say is like, actually this does happen, where when Daniel shows up and he's inspired by the military person reading what was basically like a tabloid newspaper, right? Like I was looking at some of the headlines.
Oh yeah, his burst of inspiration.
Yeah. And so he figures out their constellations, and then he goes in and he figures out the seventh symbol. And like one of the comments made is like, you figured out in 2 weeks what this team hasn't figured out in 2 years. And like, maybe that doesn't seem like a credible thing, but I think that's legitimate because I can speak to that directly with our lamp scene from Ganjivecchio, where when we're all there and we looked at this image, there's like 5 of us are like, that's a weird sex scene on a lamp. And it wasn't until later, and then I showed Lige, who hadn't been there at the time, wasn't immersed in our dirty jokes in the field. And she's like, could that be like a childbirth scene? And you're like, oh, I think you're right. And it is kind of amazing how like in the field, you are isolated in a lot of ways. And there's something that's kind of problematic about our field in that as we are making discoveries and starting to make conclusions, right? There's no input. You know, I've gone on the field and told, it's like, don't share pictures, don't tell people about like what we're discovering. There's people I know who are archaeologists who have sat on like, helped discover the throne of Mycenae, couldn't talk about it for 3 years until it's published, until conclusions have already been drawn and then given to the public. And I think that's a problem. I think that that is a critique that the public is starting to have about archaeology, is like, you're withholding information from us. Now, some of them are assuming it's aliens, and we're like, no, we're not. But at the same time, we are. There are people, there is research that never gets shared with the public because it never gets published, because maybe the person who was in charge of it lost the funding, died. Some of it, a lot of it's in storage and never sees the light of day, never has anyone time to analyze. There is so much information that we have about the past that is not privy to the public. We try to make it that way, but we very intentionally keep a lot of that hidden. And I think that's starting to bite us in the ass right now in some ways, even though, again, we're not withholding great, giant conclusions. But at the same time, that also means without that inside input or, you know, and discussion, we're drawing wrong conclusions. We're putting it out there. And then the media picks the most cool sounding ones and sensationalizes it even more. And then we're stuck with those interpretations.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's this, it's part of that sort of long-standing trope of archaeology and pseudo-archaeology, is that there's this vast trove of information right before our eyes that no one else has figured out. And, you know, that there are real, as you were saying, there are real aspects of this, especially in the history of the decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs. There are several moments where, like, somebody finally sort of bucked the trend and realized something that was right before their eyes. But to poke at Stargate for a second, as you reminded me with when he realizes that it's a constellation, that it's Orion. It is the classic one that bugs me the most, that comes up in so many pseudo-archaeological claims, where there's this assumption that Greco-Roman constellations are the same constellations that all other cultures had. Like, no,
right?
Like, it's all the same stars, but there's no reason to think that Egypt, especially no reason to think that 9,000 years ago Egypt, because they're not talking about actual Egypt here, would have drawn Orion the same way we draw Orion, or the Greco-Romans did.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really funny because I put a thing in my notes. What is it? It's always Orion, which I think
It's
is just
always
like
Orion.
it's a film shorthand thing. It's the most easily recognizable or iconic constellation. Men in Black's going to do it in a couple of years. And and I didn't even think to the, it was like, right, because I mean, constellations, like, right, you have this canvas of stars. Constellations are arbitrary. They're just, where people are going to see connections. So there's no reason to assume they are a universal constant.
At least do like the big, but probably the Big Dipper would have been the even more obvious one. But the reason like that one is kind of so obvious is like it has the tie to the North Star, which is a little more prominent in
there are legitimate stellar phenomena that everyone will recognize. There are bright stars that everyone will pick up on. But yeah, like Orion, no, not everyone does Orion. Like this has been a problem with Göbekli Tepe over the last few years. There's some folks who've been pushing some wild theories about Göbekli Tepe, and they're trying to claim that this is it 12,000 years old, 13,000 year old site in Turkey has Greco-Roman constellations. It's like, that's insane. Like, that's not the way any of this works.
No.
Sorry, I went off on constellations.
No, I love it.
No,
I
that's
love
fair.
it.
Like, right? That's.
I mean,
that's kind of.
Like, shit, you're right.
That is what the struggle is with this film. It's like, I do like this film, but oh man, does it feed into a lot of the pseudo archaeology ideas that we are contending with today that are becoming more and more vicious in the rhetoric.
That's I guess
much more vicious.
To my question of like, how much of this is this film, I guess, like symptomatic, or is it causal, or is it both, right? Is it just encapsulating what's already out there and just kind of distilling it down into its like simplest form and putting it on the screen? Or is it in itself like inspiring these sort of bad faith or, bad habits in the practice? And I don't know if this is even really answerable.
I think that's a fair question. My assessment is that because it's portrayed as like a big blockbuster film, it reads as more fictional in mind versus the fact that Roland Emmerich calls Chariot of the Gods a documentary that then inspires this. Is like, I think that is more of where the issue is like eventually you do get Ancient Aliens, you do get Graham Hancock, who is looking at archaeological data and presenting it in books, but like he is crafting the data to fit his narrative. He's not observing it in a way to follow the data to draw conclusions that way, or to get to the point of you can't draw a conclusion with the information we currently have. So the rhetoric of pseudo-archaeology is like, but what if? And I'm like, what if is cool. There's no evidence to support that what if.
I was just double checking some dates because for me, I have a hard time remembering when I first saw this film. I think I actually worked in a movie theater around this time, and I think I was working when it came out. But it was also, around that time that I don't remember if I've talked about this on the show before or not, but I got interested in archaeology by reading Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, which came out in '96. And it, pushes this narrative of a lost Ice Age civilization. And I just double checked. Robert Bouval's book, The Orion Mystery, came out in '95, which was pushing this idea that the pyramids of Giza were the same as Orion's belt. And he tries to, and again, it doesn't work. Like, you have to flip the map upside down, and it has all these massive problems with it. But those books both came out after Stargate in '94, and so in my head they all kind of blur together because that's where my brain was in the late '90s when I was starting to get interested in this stuff before I realized how wrong these things were. But I like to think of Stargate as sort of an innocuous, uninfluential, just sort of fun version of pseudoarchaeology, but in the next 2 years after it, some of the most influential pseudoarchaeology books in modern times came out in '95 and then again in '96.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. I think you could say something similar with like the Da Vinci Code coming out, then inspires a lot more interest into maybe biblical archaeology or more of that ilk. And I could definitely see like this film is like, oh, this is really cool. And then people are like, does something like a Stargate exist? And then all of a sudden you are finding popularly available books that are saying, yes,
Right.
Yeah, like was it even like, I mean, maybe it's rather than even just a simple like causational relationship, it's like Stargate proved, even though if it isn't directly influencing it, it proves the marketability or like creates an environment in which a fingerprints of the god becomes a marketable thing. And so even though Stargate isn't necessarily advocating it or inspiring any of this, like it is in of itself, like it's a sort of derivative sort of version of all these ideas that have been out there for decades at this point. But it sort of it primes the engine. That's the metaphor I'm looking for it. Is maybe where I'm falling on this one.
Sure.
But
no, it does. I feel like Stargate itself, the movie, reads as very innocuous. I think, like David said, I kind of agree. It just seems to be going for like, this is a fun, weird story. And like it's so very sci-fi, and it hits a lot of like the sci-fi rather than like fantasy kind of check boxes. And so I think Christy, I like your comparison to the Da Vinci Code of like something with like bits and pieces of things we recognize with like stuff that is obviously for a story that should obviously be for a story, and maybe some people don't think it's so obviously for a story. And so I could see like this just like for fun. I liked the Da Vinci Code. I enjoyed
I
reading,
wanted
like,
to be a symbologist. I thought that seemed so cool. I like, I could do that. That seems awesome. I love mythology and symbols.
I'm just reminded, have any of you ever been at an academic conference where the entire audience just got up and left in the middle of
No, that was harsh, man.
I've been at conferences where there have been some, slogs of papers and whatnot, but never to the point where everybody just got up and left.
I feel like the closest that Elijah and I would have come to one was at the AIAs and the...
Oh, no.
But everyone wanted to stay to see what he said and then be like, are you serious, dude? Like, you didn't just leave.
No, I feel that one.
Maybe there's something to get into with like the portrayal of the academia where they're like, what are you talking about, aliens? And then they leave. Whereas like, I feel like in an actual academic conference, knives would start getting drawn.
I feel like, I don't know if this is really the opposite. The incident that pops into my mind is sort of not everyone leaving, but everyone being shocked that the presenters like ended their talk. And I remember it so much. It was someone, I don't want to like name names, but this is a person who was well known for going on well past the 15-minute window that they're supposed to be looking in.
Yeah.
And I remember I went to this the lecture, and they ended right at 15 minutes, and they just looked like a kicked puppy. They were just like, and that is the end of my talk. And I was like, what is going on? This guy always goes on and on and on. And apparently at the previous conference that I had missed, his talk was right before lunch, and someone had like prepared a sandwich, and when he started to go on and on and on past his time, they just brought the sandwich up and put it on the podium next to him.
Harsh.
Yeah.
I love it.
Like, there is like conference drama for sure.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes, ours was corpse wine, and that need more not be said.
No, yeah. If you know, you know.
That sounds like a thing that'd come up in like a D&D game that's off the rails, where it's like your players are out of control.
It would fit in well with that. It would be a gross dungeon to walk into.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Oh man, yeah. Shoot. Where else was I?
Like, where do we even go from here?
Well, the thing is, the plot, like we've kind of actually covered most of the plot, because after that, it's like, right, the aliens come down.
The uprising, we haven't really,
yeah. We have we organize the uprising. We teach them that their gods are false.
I do find it interesting. We were talking about guns before. I kept thinking, like, if I'm stranded on a foreign planet and during the middle of an uprising, I know I have a pretty limited supply of bullets.
Yeah.
And there's no getting new ones anywhere anytime soon. And they don't seem to be concerned at all. They're just like, yeah, just keep firing away.
Well, I guess an interesting thing, question I have is like, you do obviously have a labor force mining, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it ever made clear that this is a slave force?
Yeah,
I think that's kind of interesting. in terms of like how we talk about the labor used to build
Sure.
the pyramids in Egypt as well, right? Because, you know, you get the sense of when the attack happens on them, and the dad, I can't remember his name, but he's also in The Mummy later on.
Eric Avari, that's the actor's name.
Thank
so
you.
we'll
Yeah.
just go with that.
And he says like, "Oh, this happened because we helped the strangers," and it gives you the sense that like that didn't actually commonly happen. And we know like you can study Sparta or something. It's like if you're trying to maintain a slave population, you terrorize them, you plant moles, you restrict them in a lot of ways, right? Versus this group of people, as far as I can tell, weren't chained up. They seem to have all their basic necessities met in terms of like good food, clothing, shelter. And before these people show up, the no violence necessarily against them.
It hits one of my main questions about the structure of the film. How often did Ra come by? Like, was he there often? Was he not there often? Did they see him all the time or not? Which also kind of leans into he's got a spaceship and a Stargate, and so where does he fly versus where does he like Stargate to? But yeah, it's like, you know, what the population's relationship with him is totally left undescribed. Just kind of goes back to Colin's point earlier about this is overly simplistic as a film. I think you were saying more like dumbed down Spielberg. Were you saying?
Yeah,
like
Spielberg
like
for morons was the
Spielberg
quote.
for morons. Like it's like what do they have any relationship with Ra? Are they slave labor? Have they never seen him before but just heard stories about him? It's like totally unclear.
Do they actually treat him as a god? Because it seems like maybe they do.
That they do. They definitely pray to him
because
they have his symbol.
Okay, you're right.
But they bowed out to him, don't they? At one point,
I'm thinking there's some really cool Egyptian pharaoh rituals that could have been replicated. Like we know historically existed that could have been replicated for the movie. That would have looked kind of cool and maybe would have. You know, it wasn't until like they unmasked the one guy and they're like, "Oh, he's human." I'm like, we didn't know he was human.
That's
like,
true.
Like, how do you establish yourself as like the top elite other than I guess you live in the pyramid?
Yeah, my impression was like my take on the movie is that Ra comes down periodically to collect the mineral that they're mining that he uses for his spaceship. So he has to come down at least at some point, and mostly keeps them in line via like religious fear and fervor and like the periodic demonstration of power, and then lets that do most of the work. So, but to your point, Chrissy, like yeah, sure, their needs are being met, but like they don't have to be mining all of this ore. They could be doing literally anything else with their lives.
That is true. I think that's just what the question I was struggling with, because like if you're trying to control a slave population in particular, you're not seeing enough being done to really do that in terms of like, because all that's really stated is restricting reading and writing, so they can't communicate their past history to each other. I'm like, oral history lasted for a long time, y'all. They would find a way.
I remember a few things.
Yeah. And so like the status of the laborers I found really interesting, because you know that's still questions that are asked about the status of the laborers working on the pyramids, right? Which you could argue that was more like corvée labor, like taxed labor, that they were still treated really well.
Yeah, I also think about the architecture that we are shown from where they live. It's like it almost looks like a walled city, right?
Yeah.
Like they have like, you know, 3 to 4 story buildings, it looks like, but usually you only have a walled city if you're trying to keep something out.
Dust storms in this case.
Dust storms. They do close the doors for the dust storms.
The big thing in this case. But yeah, like we don't really see like there's no civic architecture. Like they don't have a meeting house or a Senate house, for lack of a better term. There's no like theater. And even like temple, right? Like they have the big symbol of Ra, like sort of hanging over the road, but there's not even like big monumental architecture happening.
I have kind of two solutions. Well, there is the temple-ish where the Stargate is, but like one is, both are on like the sort of cinematography or like the cinematic side, which is one just like kind of general lazy world building that like there's a lot of questions about society that this film just doesn't even think to ask. And two, one of the things on the more kind of practical side, one of the things I think Roland Emmerich is known for is, as a director, being able to produce expensive looking films for surprisingly cheap budgets. And one of the ways this is done is to like save all of the money for like your big set pieces, but then actually like a lot of the movie is going to happen just like in a tent or in a single room or in a hut or whatever it is. And then so like to sneak by, and like basically the short answer is cheaper sets.
Yeah. There we go.
Fair
enough.
My thesis.
I mean, it is interesting when you compare to like his most recent project of Those About to Die, which had all of this very complex relationship between the most elite of Rome and the lowest dregs of Rome at the same time. And so, you know, that could be a difference of time. But yeah, I think that's what also makes the humans on the planet very infantilized even further, because it's just like, what is your motivation to either be loyal and work for this individual because you fear him as a god, or your life is basically not bad, so okay, this is fine, I guess. Or like there's got to be something motivating the
not to bring it back to Nam, but like we must bring democracy to the people.
Well, like, because it's stagnant, right? Like, I think that at the end of the day, what's so frustrating about it, it's like it's such a stagnant group until you have these outsiders come in and introduce
well, yeah, and like
civilization,
the kind of the
Democracy
brutal
or-
sequel
Yeah.
is like the children that armed and were part of that initial rebellion are now going to install themselves in as the new ruling class and like create this like hierarchical tiered society. But to kind of bring the like impose more logic on the film and like chase down connections that this film is not asking. But I just had a thought of like, okay, so if, you know, Egyptian civilization is inspired by Ra and his whole aesthetic, and the ancient Egyptians overthrew and drove out Ra, you know, centuries or millennia ago. But that means that the actual pharaohs living in Egypt in the intervening centuries are basically cosplaying as Ra this entire time. They're like cosplaying as an alien to be pharaoh or whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, and I think it would have come across more as an hierarchical society had they kept the story, like the characterization of Ra's character as a human, and then you have that class of humans and maybe show, because like I initially thought when we saw the one, I'm going to blank on his name again, the one guy, because he's more dressed, he's the one who's kind of giving them the tour, he's the dad, and he seems like he would be that kind of middleman overseer, right? Like you would think you would show a level of domination over people below him to like maintain the system, but he's not. Like it seems very communal versus like had you kept all of the very pharaonic Egyptian looking people as like, no, we're the overseers, we're the ones that exert the force, that would have come across a lot more strongly.
I think also though, if like Horus or whatever, one of those guards, if those guys were around in the town, then like the movie just can't happen. Because like part of the whole conceit is they get to the town, and then while they're off, that their guys back in the temple get ambushed by Horus soldiers or whatever. Right. So like these people need to be somewhat independent.
I do actually, just thinking of from a movie making perspective, I do like that scene a lot, where in essence they keep going back and forth between the soldiers who stayed at the pyramid and the spaceship is landing. They're getting attacked by the guards, and the partying keeps happening back at the village. And it's a very good cut back and forth set of scenes where it's like, you know, you as the viewer knows that everything's going badly, and yet they're eating whatever that reptile thing is that tastes like a chicken.
Oh my god! Out loud, I went, "Is he going to say it tastes like chicken?" And lo and behold, he does.
Which again speaks to the culture of archaeologists or anthropologists who travel to other parts of the world. Is like, you do eat the cuisine and you do hope it tastes like chicken.
Yes, I was explaining to my child the other day that I have eaten iguana, and it does taste a little bit like chicken.
We're just past an hour now, but before we leave, I did want to talk about Ra.
Yes, I do too.
Who's in not as much of this movie as I remember, but
very, very few scenes. But I feel like he ate in all of them.
Ra is hot.
Oh yeah. So do you know actually about this actor Jay Davidson? Because it's fascinating. Where
Please tell me
well,
more.
I know what
more.
trivia I learned from the movie, and that's part of my critique here.
Hated this movie. Hated movies broadly, but
Interesting.
which I think, if anything, lends itself to the performance because like that disdain
Yes.
of that he like, I don't want to be here talking to you. Jay Davidson was a model, was sort of literally at a party, and a director saw him and cast him as a key character in a movie called The Crying Game, where he plays a trans character, and it's a big reveal in the movie. He's a love interest, and then it's sort of revealed. Gets an Academy Award for debut performance. Is a lot of buzz surrounding Jay. Gets cast for this movie, or gets an offer, I should say, for this movie. His experience was like, I hated being in a movie. I don't want to be famous. I don't want to like be in movies. This is not my thing. And so to try like to get out of it and to try to save some face, asks for $1 million. And Roland Emmerich just says, okay. And so Jay Davidson made $1 million as Ra and is in the movie for like maybe 15 minutes.
Wow.
Okay. So there's a lot to his character too. So for one, apparently costuming didn't like him because he refused to take off his nipple piercings. So costuming had to work around that. Was mentioned in the fun facts of the film.
That he stripped naked at the end of filming?
I don't know.
I heard he hated the costume so much that the last time they called cut, he just stripped butt ass naked, like on set.
And so the thing is like, again, I think he's hot, like, and is androgynous, has a really great androgynous look in this film. And what was really interesting, so part of why the change was made from him being a human working for Ra to being possessed by the alien is because initial screen testings were awful. They viewed his character as not really a genuine threat. So what they did is changed him to being possessed by an alien, and then in post-production added the voice lowering and the glowing eyes.
The glowing eye, okay.
And so it's really interesting because Devlin, who's one of the other co-creator on this film, he suggests like that his character didn't come across well because he was struggling with drugs and alcohol addiction at the time. So he's saying the acting wasn't very good. And it's like, I don't know, when all of a sudden you have an audience be like, oh, the androgynous looking man who is an alien and has lowered the voice register. Now we get it. Now it's a threat because it's both alien and slightly more masculine. And I'm like, sure. It was an act. I maybe there was some acting issue there, but like, I don't think that was the problem. So that was my thought on his character.
Yeah, fix it in post. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, I like love knowing that because I do feel like that disdain, especially toward the end when he has like the horns and the sun behind him and sort of like this like headpiece. He just, and it's like every time they cut back to him, he's just standing there and like maybe looking, and it's just like, oh God, no! It's like you feel very disconcerted
and all
about
these
it.
like kind of creepy like eunuch children or whoever they are, like running around.
Yeah, those never get explained really in this like, change of the story.
They don't need to be explained, but just all of it has
apparently
like, the
they were meant to be
level.
Off-putting. So
good
the inclusion of the children, but again, it's like. Off-putting how? Are you suggesting?
Yeah, I get where you're going.
Queer presenting evil guy?
Yep.
Yeah.
Or
so like
it was the 90s.
Problems there. But like
the 90s.
I did love Raw. Loved Raw.
Yes.
And it's interesting. That's interesting to hear some of that background because he is in the final presentation of the film. I find him to be a very impressive, imposing, sneering villain. And I suppose it helps if you don't like your role. You can sneer a little bit more.
Yes.
Yeah.
The craziest also is like the story of who was the sort of second in line to be Ra. It was just some old guy, like just I forget who it was. No one, I didn't ring any bells, but it was not Jay Davidson, basically.
Yeah.
That was a unique thing. I love that he asked for $1 million and got it. Has never been in a movie since.
Brilliant. He knew what he wanted.
Yeah.
It was $1 million.
What he really wanted was not to do it, but hey, Go out big. There you go.
Oh my god, so good.
All right. So yeah, they fight in the Stargate. They send a nuclear bomb up into the spaceship, and then Kurt Russell now has been reinvigorated with a new sense for life.
He's
and
good now.
He's
He
Yeah,
doesn't
he's
need
good.
therapy. This is the 90s. We don't do therapy.
No.
Well, also, like with his character, like he was fully prepared to stay on this alien planet and die because he's like, I've got nothing to live for now that my kid is dead. Which I guess like his wife, I suppose. But
Yeah. I heard the saddest story yesterday, you guys, when I took my car in to get serviced, and there's a guy close to my age next to me, and he's being told he needs to replace his tires, and he goes, "How soon do I need to have that done?" And they go, "Before inclement weather." And his response was, "Oh, okay. I'm recently divorced, so I don't have to buy Christmas presents this year, I guess."
Oh, ouch.
What?
I was afraid you were going to say something like, "Guess my kid won't be getting braces" or something.
Yeah, like I was prepared for something else like that. Oh
that
god,
was bad, but it wasn't as bad as I sort of feared.
That was bad, but still pretty depressing.
good lord.
And so that made me think of this scene. I'm like, Kurt Russell probably doesn't need to buy Christmas presents this year.
Yeah.
Or is that?
Kurt Russell, like, I mean, I love Kurt Russell, but I feel there's something, maybe he's like, there's an ill fit or something going on here. Cause like Kurt Russell to me is at his strongest where he's like, when he's a parody of an action hero, like in Big Trouble in Little China, where he's like kind of a buffoonish, high energy kind of goof. And he's like, he thinks he's an action hero, but nobody else does. Whereas this is kind of the reverse, and he's just sort of stoic and low energy. But
also, would he not be more traumatized by the end of this? Because I do remember the very like artful scene of the one kid's best friend going up in an explosion and his helmet rolls across the ground, and the young man is being held back because he's so upset. I'm like, but Kurt Russell's good.
Yeah, it is such an odd twist for him at the end, because it's like he's traumatized because his son shot himself, and now he's revitalized because Kurt Russell got to teach a bunch of other young boys how to use guns, and only some of them died. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense as but I take Colin's point, because I feel like the standout line in this movie is when the guards like flip Kurt Russell's hood off, and what does he say? Is like, "Hey, how's it going?" and shoots the guard. It's like when he gets to be. He doesn't do straight man very well. He needs the buffoonery.
Yes, he needs the smarminess, the goofiness, the cockiness. Like that's when Kurt Russell is really like kind of firing on all cylinders.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. So I guess a question to ask to kind of wrap that up is, we barely talked about Daniel, because Daniel is Milo. If you guys saw Disney's Atlantis, he is Milo.
I guess I have an important question. Have you done the Disney Atlantis movie yet? Have I missed that? Because if you haven't, I am coming back.
It is ripe for, I'm ready to come. Well, it's funny because how much I love this movie is directly inverse proportional.
I know.
To how much
Colin hates it. And I'm like, I don't understand.
And it all comes back. It's the like, at least this movie, I will give this movie credit that the language that they speak is like an offshoot of ancient Egyptian that like, it's unlikely how quickly he learns it, but like that is basically the same language with some sound changes.
Yes.
Is an actual somewhat plausible thing. Whereas what Atlantis does, I'm mad just thinking about it. So I got.
They did consult linguists, so like not completely implausible, but not in the time period of when it all happened. So
I think it's actually really implausible.
It's insanely implausible.
Fine.
It is.
It's a children's movie, Colin.
Well,
You're supposed to watch it with childlike wonder and leave it at that.
Like, it's so bad that it was like it draws attention to itself for how ridiculous it is. Where it's like that because they speak the like proto language, that they are able to reverse engineer or just engineer all other languages, including idioms and terms of phrase and like weirdly cultural. Like you're able to predict that like Latin would like branch off from Indo-European, then branch off into these 5 languages, which would later go back and reincorporate words from Latin into their lexicon. Like you knew that, you knew they were going to do that. And like, had they just said nothing, you would have, because it's fine. There's tons of movies where people who have no business speaking each other's languages. I mean, for fuck's sake, Pocahontas, they speak, everybody speaks the same language, and it's not a bad.
And like, at least they have technology. They have weird mystical technology that could have just explained it. They all have their own little lockets.
But they don't know how to use it.
I know, but like it could just because you don't know how to use it doesn't mean it can't just because everyone has the locket. It could just automatically translate for you.
Exactly. You could have had a line that like the magic crystal translates, and you're like, perfect.
Elijah's
no questions
dying over there.
But no, you have to take like 8 extra steps. It's like that meme where it's like the person doing the gymnastics routine to like faceplant at the end. It's like you go through like the hoops, then the bars, then the uneven bars, and the pommel horse, and then you just flat the landing.
The flying cars.
So anyway, yeah.
Okay.
Cars,
To bring it all back, my point was like Daniel is Milo. That story arc of Milo is basically what happened to Daniel. He gets the girl at the end. He
100%.
stays with his. He basically gets to do what Indiana Jones wanted to do in Dial of Destiny, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
He's living his Captain Kirk fantasies.
Yeah.
Yes.
And is like that's what's interesting, right? And then Kurt Russell is supposed to be a other very focused character. I don't know that they feel like a foil to each other in any way. Like
except that there's just one's a jock and one's a nerd. That's it.
Yeah.
Right? That's the depth.
Yeah.
He calls him a dweeb at one point, right? It is the like
Yes.
I call it a dweeb in my notes.
It's another trope of like, the jock and the nerd. Except you're right; they don't really interact that much and talk that much, and there's no chemistry built between them or anything.
Not at all.
It's like the protagonist could have been in 2 completely different movies with their story arcs, but they happen to be in this one at the same time.
Again, to me, it kind of feels a little bit like test run E for Jeff Goldblum, Will Smith in whatever 3 or 4 years we're gonna say, which is like the sort of better version of that dynamic, where they actually get to play off one another a little bit.
Because like that feels a lot more buddy cop-y, and this has none of that. They're like that's non-existent here.
Yeah. I guess that was just my question is like, why have Kurt Russell's character have this very tragic storyline and then just at the end say, oh, it's okay now. But like, what does it bring to the movie? Or even less, what does Daniels bring to the movie? Not much other than he kind of causes all the problems. So
I think it's so you can put 2 names on the marquee.
That's fair.
Sure.
That's
so
fair.
you can over the poster say James Spader, Kurt Russell.
All right. Well,
now, since this movie came out while I was working in the movie theater, I'm reminded of another film that I don't remember the title of it, but it had Steven Seagal on the headliner, and Seagal's character died within like the first 3 minutes of the movie, and it's like they just wanted to put him on the poster. It's like you got to have Kurt Russell, and you can't have just one person.
Yeah, it's got to function as a 2-hander. I mean, there's like some weird kind of studio math because like I think neither of these guys are like they're not Bruce Willis or even I guess Will Smith. We're still a few years out from like peak Will Smith, where like he could ask for whatever he wants, but they probably are coming a little bit on again to the Roland Emmerich like blockbuster on a budget thing. These actors are probably a little more cost effective.
Okay, quick question, because I think this is the film that I had mostly remembered Kurt Russell in. Is he in the one with Goldie Hawn that's like
he married Goldie Hawn?
Right. It's like Shipwrecked or something like that. Like she's a snobby rich lady who falls off a boat and gets amnesia, and then he's
very possible.
A boat repair guy with like a bunch of kids, and he needs someone to watch the kids because his wife died, so he pretends they're married to each other.
Don't know that one.
Maybe. I mean, just to look through his filmography really quick, right around now. I mean,
he did Romance in the Stone, right? Was that before this?
Yeah.
That was Michael Douglas. Was he in that? He was in.
Was that Michael Douglas? Not Kirk. Excuse me. Yeah. Sorry.
So Kurt Russell. I mean, he was a child actor back in the '60s, but he used cars in the '80s. Escape from New York. The Thing. His '80s were kind of his big action run.
Overboard. That's it.
Yes.
That's what I remember Kurt Russell from. That is my movie reference.
Tequila Sunrise, Tango and Cash is 89. He was in Backdraft, Captain Ron, Tombstone. In the 90s, he's kind of transitioning into his little more like, maybe not quite elder statesman, but he's got Tombstone. Oh, he's Elvis in Forrest Gump. I didn't realize that.
Really? I didn't know that either.
There's actually, it's fun.
Bone Tomahawk? So good.
Kurt Russell actually met Elvis, or he appeared on screen with Elvis when he was a child actor. There's like an early Elvis film where Elvis goes up to some kid to like ask him for something, and that kid is Kurt Russell. So it's actually, that's kind of funny that he later played Elvis, having starred alongside him.
That's funny.
Yeah, Vanilla Sky, Interstate. Anyway, yeah, love Kurt Russell. Interesting phases, but
very much so.
All right. Did anyone else
Tomahawk
final
is a good
thoughts?
movie.
I have maybe a weird final question to work with, but
shoot. Yeah.
All right. My weird final question is like, if you got to hop into a Stargate that took you to a population of people that spoke a dead language, and you could have your own language immersion course by hanging out with them for a while, what language would you hope they were speaking so that you could learn it?
Dave, you gonna his with the classical Mayan?
Yeah, I mean, I love myself some Yucatec Mayan, but it's still spoken, so it's not like gone. As much as I don't think I want to go back to classical era Maya. I just want to stick with my Yucatec because I want to be join the Cruzobe and follow the Talking Cross. But that's a whole other story unto itself.
I mean, do I say classical Latin? That would be the one that I might have a shot at.
Same. I mean, that's what I'm thinking. But it's like, I also do speak some Italian. So I'm like, is that kind of like the equivalent of going back to...
Actually, I actually have a genuine answer, which is I kind of the split in the difference, which is like I do know Latin and I do know some Portuguese, but the intermediate between the two gets very interesting. Something like Iberian, Galicio-Portuguese, kind of right. It's very ambiguous. Somewhere in between the like 6th and 12th centuries CE, something's happened in there. So that kind of that sort of straddly zone.
That's awesome. Yeah.
I think I'm gonna go with I want to go to Crete to like when the Minoans are there, figure out what the hell their linear A is, then I can come back and solve linear A.
That's a good one. That's a very good one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be able to do anything, but it would be really interesting to hear like Oscan or like
Felician, one of the alt Italic languages.
Yeah, the alt Italic.
Or even Etruscan.
Yeah, Etruscan would be really cool.
Which is, I checked out a book it's on my shelf, and I was just out of pure curiosity, I was just poking around on Etruscan, and because we have a limited lexicon, like we have a couple hundred words and a basic understanding of the grammar, but it's so fragmentary that like we can read these inscriptions, but most of them are toponyms or
their
names and things like that. Yeah, names of gods, things like that, and there's a lot of grammar questions that we just don't have the evidence to say anything about. And I feel that way about Punic as well. I'm very fascinated by Punic.
This makes me want to revise my answer and go to Epi-Olmec times. There's some.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Olmec possibly.
Well, Olmec, like there's Olmec culture more or less collapses by around 400, 300 BC. And there's some, relatively speaking, small sites that stay in the area for the next few hundred years. But they start, there's a handful of examples of incredibly elaborate script coming out of the Epi-Olmec sites. There's like, my favorite is the La Mohara Stela, which is just incredibly long inscription that it's probably in some sort of Proto-Mihezoque language, but it was found in a riverbank. Like, it's not even at a big site. It's just like, oh yeah, here's this like really long late pre-classic script that is associated with no real big sites. Like, why not? Let's just have a long, elaborate thing.
Do you think it was like somebody was like had it in their cart or on their raft and it just like tipped overboard or something? And just
could be, yeah. I haven't seen like a detailed analysis of the find site, but it doesn't the Olmec themselves were really good at just leaving sculpture along the landscape. Like, that was clearly a cultural meme where they would, plant a sculpture somewhere, but that wasn't necessarily in a settlement site. So maybe some of that's carrying over. I don't know, but
it makes sense as like a boundary stone, especially since waterways would help form natural barrier. Like,
there's definitely some that seem to be marking. Like, there's who did this? Was it Ann Cyphers? I think it might have been Ann Cyphers who did this analysis a while ago, where like these Olmec sites, they're at the big Olmec sites. Cats or images of felines are sort of, they look like they're on sort of neutral territory, but outside the landscape statues, the cats are always dominating. Like the cats are in positions of power, and so that might be sort of a reference to the Olmec themselves as dominating and showing their power in feline form.
Oh, I love that.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
So
like the
cool.
size of the jaguar or the ocelot or whatever it is like relative to like what's our like.
The Olmecs have
What's our
gone
sway
up my tier of like ancient societies to admire because they like cats so much. They're cat people.
Oh yeah. The Los Azulzul statue, you have two people bowing to a jaguar. It's pretty good.
Love it.
Yes.
Yes. Very fun.
Should we wrap it up there?
I think so.
I think so.
All right. Thank you once again, David. It was so great having you on the show. If listeners want to read or watch or hear more from you, where can they do that?
Well, I think nowadays I am posting under DSA Archaeology on Threads and Blue Sky, and I have a Facebook page for that as well. That's sort of a professional page rather than a personal page. And so those are the best places to sort of just, if you want random meanderings and memes about the ancient world, you will find me there. And that is where I always like to post new publications and other sundry things. So that is the best place to come and find me these days.
Excellent. And listeners, as usual, you can find us on Blue Sky at Dig Movies. That's the right one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're technically still on X, but like it's toxic. Don't go there. You all come find us on Blue Sky.
I pulled the trigger and deleted my account.
I'm pretty close. I need to set some time aside to like just download our own data off of it and then.
So yeah, abandon that like it's a alien spaceship with a nuclear bomb inside of it. Another thing, it's weird that Roland Emmerich did that twice.
He did that twice.
Yeah, he did.
If it ain't broken, don't fix it.
if I had a nickel for every time we dropped off a nuke inside an alien spaceship. But yes, follow us on social media at Dig Movies. You can find us on movieswedig.com as well as on most major streaming platforms. Please rate, review, and subscribe. That really helps us out a lot. And we'll be back very shortly, I believe, with more archaeology.
That or Gladiator 2.
Or Gladiator 2. That's right. I'm probably going to see it this weekend.
Oh my God.
I'm seeing that Black Friday. I'm excited.
I know. I'm seeing it on Friday too.
Less horrified.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everyone. David, thanks again for coming on the show. We loved having you.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And here to join us on one final... Nope. I read it.
I know. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's the Ron Burgundy thing where it's like, if it's in front of me, I'll read it. You can put this in at the end.